For those who don't know me, my name is Lori Power. My company is MP Benefits, and I'm a group benefit consultant. Part of my credo to my clients and associates alike is to be consistently responsive to their needs. One of those needs is to understand where we stand with regards to the vaccine and the pandemic. And today I'm very pleased to bring in Melissa Boyles from Prowse Chowne to talk about this very issue. Thanks so much for coming
today. And as Lori said, this is going to be a really loose conversation. And the reason being is that there's really no case law that deals with employment in a pandemic yet in the legal sphere. Certainly we can start looking to other spheres to say, well, how are they handling these types of situations? One of those being in the labor kind of sector, in what are the arbitration decisions that are coming out of that sector? So that's kind of the big overarching theme here, is that we don't know what the courts are going to do or what's going to be deemed to be legal or not. But I think we can make some pretty good guesses or estimates as to what we might see coming down the pipeline.
The thing I want to ask you though, Melissa, as we get going, is there is a lot of information coming out in the media, but it doesn't, Murray and I were talking about this as well, it doesn't seem that there's consistency. And I know that you're going to go through a little bit about that today, but even in articles that I read this morning that were just released today, they're talking about human rights, but it doesn't hold with occupational health, nor does it hold with employment standards. So I hope that we'll be able to go through a little bit of that today as well.
Yeah, exactly. And those are kind of the big sections that I'm going to touch on in terms of what I think, and some important questions I think we can pose to the room to say, well, how can we compare this to another situation? So really, I've looked some articles up, I've looked at arbitration decisions, I've tried to look into the law to see what can we expect. I've seen articles from lawyers I really respect that say vaccinations will be mandatory in the workplace. And then on the converse, I've seen articles from other lawyers I really respect that say they absolutely will not be. That's a huge violation of everybody's privacy rights and the duty to accommodate. So really, the legal sphere is not settled on this issue either. And that's something that we have to play around with in our employment litigation group when we're getting these phone calls to say, well, my employer tells me I have to get tested. My employer tells me I have to get vaccinated. My employer tells me I have to wear a mask in the workplace. Those are the types of things that we're considering when we're giving advice to those types of clients. So as I kind of get into this, the first thing that I kind of want to talk about is the duty to accommodate, because that's going to be a huge overarching theme in any type of COVID and employment conversations. So the duty to accommodate, at least in Alberta, is under Alberta human rights legislation. And really what it means is that an employer has a duty to accommodate their employees up to the point of undue hardship. And largely what that I see meaning in kind of a COVID area is a lot of the duty to accommodate work from home arrangements. And that's going to include situations where people have to care for family members who are perhaps immunocompromised or sick as a result of COVID, or perhaps being sick themselves. We also look at scenarios where perhaps somebody themselves is immunocompromised and no longer feels comfortable coming into the workplace. So if employers say you either get vaccinated or you're fired, well, I think that there's going to be some overarching issues about the duty to accommodate. Maybe there's a happy medium where we're saying this person has established they do not want to be vaccinated, they do not believe in the vaccination, but at the same time, they're able to do their job from home. So the employer might have an obligation to accommodate that on an ongoing basis. And the interesting thing that I think is that COVID has really shown us that most employers in kind of a typical office setting can accommodate that. When we look at other professions, so perhaps healthcare practitioners or factory workers, that duty to accommodate is going to change because those individuals can't necessarily do their jobs from home. So when we start looking at, okay, what is the duty to accommodate and what is undue hardship, we also have to factor in the employer's duty to provide a safe work environment. So not only does the employer have to accommodate people who say are sick or don't want to get vaccinated or don't want to get tested, but at the same time, on the converse, the employer has a duty to provide a safe work environment. And if they fail to do so, that can result in a huge negligence claim. You can imagine an employer who comes out and takes a stance that they don't believe the vaccination's real, they don't believe COVID's real, and in fact, nobody in their workplace can be vaccinated. And as a result, an employee or a family member of an employee passes away. And whether or not you're able to prove that correlation and be able to show that that person did in fact contract that at work, that employer is going to be looking at lawsuits, in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's going to be, in my opinion, a direct violation of that duty to provide that safe workplace. So there's going to be this kind of balancing act that has to happen between accommodating employees up to that point of undue hardship, but also providing a safe working environment. Also, of course, if an employer takes a hard stance and says, well, because you refuse to be vaccinated, or because you refuse to wear a mask, or because you refuse to test, we're then going to fire you, is that in itself possibly a constructive dismissal? So we might be looking at constructive dismissal claims where an employee says that, I had to quit my job because my employer won't accommodate me. I can't possibly be in this workspace anymore, but they've made it impossible for me. So I'm bringing a claim that says I've now been fired from my workplace because my employer is making it impossible for me to be an employee anymore. So not only do we have these Alberta human rights kind of areas that are being triggered, but of course, employment standards as well. And the constructive dismissal piece, which is essentially, your employer making it so impossible for you to stay in the workspace or changing the terms of your contract with them substantially, in the sense that as a result, you quit, but you've deemed that you've been constructively dismissed. So I think we're going to see a huge kind of uptake in those types of constructive dismissal cases, as well as a result of workplace policies and people's interpretation of whether they're able to then stay in their current position as a result of those policies. The other thing, of course, on the complete flip side of all of that is a privacy concern. And this is going to be the conversation you're seeing in the media all the time. And that's really, are there going to be vaccination passports? And is my employer going to require me to show and prove that I have in fact been vaccinated? And an employer has a duty to collect, use, and disclose employee information in a very careful manner. And this can be looked at as a serious privacy concern, because if my employer is asking me to prove that I've been vaccinated for COVID-19, then my employer also now asks me to prove that, for example, I don't have HIV/AIDS? Or can my employer ask me to prove that I've been vaccinated for the common flu? It starts a bit of a spiral effect where we say, why do we differentiate COVID-19 outside of all of these other issues that in themselves can also be lethal at some point? So I think that if we're saying in the workplace, your employer is going to have the ability to say, you have to prove you've been vaccinated, we're going down a very slippery slope. Because then what more can your employer ask you to prove? Can they ask you to prove you don't have, a specific cancer gene in your DNA one day? And that's really taking it to a really far extreme. But the short answer is, what differentiates COVID-19 from the common flu, from AIDS, HIV virus, from any of these other intractable diseases? And why are we just testing and vaccinating for this one? And I think the short answer is that because we're in a pandemic right now, and we're in a situation where at this current moment in time, we've got a deadly disease that's moving through the population quickly, and the concern is keeping hospitalization down. But when the pandemic ends, to keep being able to say we have to require vaccinations or require proof of vaccinations for COVID-19 outside of the context of a pandemic, I think that starts to violate a lot of privacy concerns, because then we get that slippery slope where we say, well, what more do you need to be able to prove to be an employee at this place?
What's to stop if it's been allowable for the last year because of pandemic, if certain rules have been stretched or modified during a pandemic, what's to stop that being grandfathered in once the pandemic concern is over and you lead to those privacy situations? I'm already seeing in Ontario, the arbitrators are filing in favor of employers in a unionized setting saying that proof of vaccination is mandatory. So leading on that note, where will that lead us going down the road, do you think?
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because, as I've said, the courts haven't looked at this issue yet. The arbitrators have in the union context or in a labor context, but what are the courts going to turn to? Are they going to look at those decisions from those arbitrators and say, we think this is the right kind of legal recourse to follow? Or are they going to take from a completely separate area and say, we disagree, this is a huge privacy concern. How are employees storing this data, or employers storing this data? You know, who has access to this data? What kind of prejudice does that create in the workplace? You know, all of a sudden, are we dealing with a brand new issue of discrimination, which I think is already pretty rampant in the community, which is, you know, have you had COVID-19? Are you sick? Are you an individual in a community that's being essentially blamed for COVID-19? You know, we start getting into a lot of these discrimination issues. And I think to have that mandatory, yes, you know, your employer can require you to be vaccinated, or yes, your employer can require you to prove vaccination or prove testing, starts contributing to some of that prejudice potentially. And that's not to say that I'm against, you know, vaccinations by any means, and everybody has their own opinion on that. But I think when we start to weigh those concerns with the duty to accommodate and with the potential hazards in terms of privacy violations, you know, I think that the courts are going to have to play somewhat of a balancing act to say, well, you know, how far can an employer intrude into your personal life, or what information can they take from you, and what's going to be considered to be discrimination at the end of the day.
So Melissa, follow-up question. Employers have a duty to provide a safe environment. Isn't there an argument to be made the fact that if you have some employees who decide, I don't want to be vaccinated, others who were very concerned about that are vaccinated and now say, look, I don't feel safe at work because my coworker or coworkers are not vaccinated. So you're not doing your job to provide a safe environment.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that when we look at the issue of safety versus the issue of privacy, often I think safety is going to be kind of number one. How can we make the safest work environment? But in that scenario, I don't think the employer can simply say, well, I have a standalone policy that says that if you don't get vaccinated, you can't work here anymore, unless they've taken some steps to still try to accommodate that employee. I think that that's kind of where the line needs to be drawn. And again, this is my opinion. The courts haven't made a decision on this yet. But, you know, if you take a case like, for example, a factory, that's really one we've seen in Alberta where there's been a lot of COVID outbreak. In that type of situation, if the employer is saying, well, employees need to be vaccinated, or in fact have to have mandatory incremental testing, and an employee refuses to do so because of the huge safety concern, that might be a case where the court kind of parcels that out and says, in these specific circumstances, vaccinations have to be mandatory. And that's a little bit of what's been happening in the arbitration world, in the labor world. So I'll give you an example. There's a labor decision that came out recently in Ontario that talks about a retirement home and mandatory testing. So not quite up to the mandatory vaccination place, but mandatory testing for COVID-19. And the arbitrator in that case found that the swab testing wasn't such a violation of privacy that it outweighed the safety concerns, because we're talking about a high-risk population, an immunocompromised population. So in that circumstance, they said, yes, mandatory testing is okay here because of the types of people, the types of jobs that you're doing and who you're exposing yourself to. So I can see, you know, in a healthcare profession, in a factory setting, in a setting where you're working with immunocompromised people, or you're working with elderly people, you know, perhaps the courts are going to say this is a reasonable profession or area where we're going to say vaccinations mandatory. But when we go into kind of the office setting, like for example, my job, you know, if my employer told me I can't come into the office unless I'm vaccinated, I already know that I can work from home and I can do so effectively. And in fact, when I appear in court right now, I appear via video. So it's a different context, right?
Sure. Yeah. My question was more regarding the travel aspect. So we have people that obviously travel for work. not only in Canada, but overseas or wherever. We can't control other countries from demanding a passport to go into those countries to work. But I was wondering if that would change the factor, because a lot of places, it could be even between provinces, like you might not be able to get into another province unless you've been vaccinated. So in that case, the duty to accommodate your job is limited if you're a salesperson or person that has to do that travel. And then obviously if your employer depends on you to get the vaccine in order to do your job by traveling, then the privacy concern where they're actually seeing that passport or the confirmation of vaccine would change that factor as well.
Kind of my thought is on how that might shape out in the future. Keep in mind, the duty to accommodate is only to the point of undue hardship. The employer doesn't have to, completely change its entire business because it's trying to accommodate a singular employee, but it does have to take reasonable steps to accommodate. So in a scenario where an employee says, I don't want to be vaccinated, perhaps the employer doesn't have a mandatory vaccination policy, but in order to do their job to go into those other countries, they require vaccinations. I think number one, the employer has to look at that employee's job and say, is there any way they can do this without travel? Is it possible? Can we do it virtually? Or can we maybe reposition their job a little bit so that it involves less travel, but they're still as effective in their position? Now, if the answer is absolutely not, this is a person who does straight sales and they have to travel to this province or this country who have these restrictions, and they say, well, I don't want to do it. I think in that circumstance, perhaps it's going to be grounds for termination, because in that scenario, the employer has done everything they can to accommodate that circumstance.
I guess kind of two things. First of all, the way that I've been looking a lot of these, and Murray can probably comment as well, is that we have emergency measures that we have to do right now because the government says so. But at some point, we are going to be like, this will be the normal way that we're working. And so I would imagine that some of the things that you're talking about will change depending on, like, when the government says, hey, you're free to do what you want to do now, it's not an emergency anymore. So now it's on us as the business owners to make those decisions, right?
Yeah, and I think that that's where we're going to start having those arguments where a business owner is going to say, I want to be as diligent as I can possibly be. My number one concern is safety. I'm implementing a policy that vaccinations are mandatory. And, some unlucky employer out there is going to be the first one that has an employee challenge it in the courts and says, no, I don't think this is a reason why I shouldn't be able to be employed. And it's going to run up the system. And I would, imagine it's going to go all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada. That's going to be a decision that we're going to see go all the way up.
So
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say my follow-up to that would be, because we have to accommodate to a point of undue hardship. So if we, sent a survey out to our staff and said, would you feel safe working beside a coworker who's not vaccinated, or would you continue to come to work, without knowing the vaccination status of your coworkers? And, a second question saying, would you be willing to disclose your vaccination status as part of your employment? If you had like a certain number, like if 2/3 of your staff said, I would not continue to come to work, I would not feel safe coming to work with someone who is not vaccinated, does that then kind of prove that, it needs to be mandatory and you're not going to accommodate those one-offs that aren't doing it?
I think that what I would say to that is, is that maybe evidence in the case that you were getting into a legal battle at the end of the day, towards saying, yes, I had to do this to create a safe work environment. Look at these responses, look at the concerns my employees have expressed, perhaps, but the duty to accommodate individual employees is really what Alberta Human Rights talks about. So if, you have 2/3 of them that say, we're really uncomfortable with this, then you have to look at the other 1/3 and say, what can we do to, keep them out of the office, but still allow them to remain employed? And that's, again, up to the point of undue hardship, in which case, if they're saying we won't come into the workplace at all and we won't do our job, then I think there's going to be grounds for dismissal down the road. But again, with absolute mandatory vaccinations, I think there's going to be issues there, even just looking in the religious context. Are individuals going to come forward and say, well, I don't believe in this as a result of my religion? And that has to do with masks as well, and testing as well. So, it's almost going to be a per case scenario, which is why I think that any employer who's in this room right now really probably wants to sit down at some point with legal counsel or maybe another professional and go through their policies and say, what are we going to do? Because I think we have to look at this as employee per employee per employee. How do we protect the most people? But how do we, kind of shield ourselves from potential litigation, or, from potentially being the big name at the Supreme Court of Canada, right? Where that's the case everyone's referring to.
Yeah, I was just curious because, as an employer, if one of your employees comes to you asking for accommodation, regardless of what it's for, typically if it's for a disability or something like that, there's typically some documentation that they need to provide from a healthcare professional or from somebody to the employer, because if not, I mean, you could have every employee walking up and saying, I just don't believe in it, or I just don't want to, or whatever that is. So is there some kind of framework that employers can put around those steps, that request for accommodation?
It's an interesting question, because we've never dealt with, in an accommodation scenario, a pandemic or a global disease, right? So of course, if I say, I'm really sick and I need you to accommodate me outside of the COVID context, I would expect that my employer would require some medical information to suggest that that's the case. And then I would, move on with life. There's some restrictions around that, so I want to be a little bit careful about what I'm saying there. But, generally speaking, yes, there is some obligation to say this is why I need to be accommodated, or some evidence to suggest that. When we talk about COVID-19, what evidence is going to exist other than saying, show you that I haven't been vaccinated because I don't have my stamp on my passport. So that's me saying I haven't been vaccinated. Not that I think passports are going to happen, by the way, but it's a conversation that's happening in the media. I think though, because of and this is completely my opinion, but because of the uniqueness of the situation with COVID, I think that there's going to be people who do take advantage of that and say, I love working from home. I don't want to go back to the office. Maybe they even do have their COVID shot, but they tell their employer they don't. In that scenario, really, what can the employer do? I don't think they can challenge them and say, I don't believe you. This isn't your belief system. I really think that that's going to get that employer in hot water with respect to Alberta human rights. So in terms of the kind of power that employees might have as a result of what's happening with the pandemic, that might increase a little bit. And I think employers are going to have to do a little bit of bending over backwards to accommodate, at least in the early stages, until we start leveling things back out and the pandemic kind of scenario calms down to a certain degree, where we're looking at COVID-19 more like a flu, or hopefully, there's no more extreme variants and we're not staying in this state forever. But we're saying, okay, COVID-19 seasonal, we're looking at it like the flu. We don't require people to prove they've had flu vaccinations in most jobs. In the arbitration context, sometimes they do. But once that calms down, that accommodation, I think, will kind of come back up to that level of normality, where we're saying, well, what's reasonable? What's a reasonable accommodation?
Yeah, so I'm actually here on behalf of my husband. He owns a survey company. And so his employees work out in the field together, but they often ride in the same trucks. So would he be able to enforce other safety measures if an employee did not want to get vaccinated, like mask wearing, or, mask wearing would be the biggest one, but distancing too, I guess.
Yeah, and I think, it's hard for me to say yes or no, because again, we haven't seen how that's actually played out in the law. We're seeing issues with masks more starting to come up the pipeline because it's been around longer. People are challenging that decree that we all have to wear masks. But I think if we're talking about the actual responsibility of the employer to have a safe working environment, that those are reasonable requests. So to say, we're not going to make a blanket policy that you have to be vaccinated, but if you choose not to be vaccinated, you do need to take these steps. And if you refuse to take these steps, those are grounds for termination because they're reasonable given the circumstances and given the health and safety of other employees. So that's the way that I would look at that type of scenario to say, yes, they have to wear masks. Perhaps they have to arrive to work in a different vehicle. You know, if they don't have access to a vehicle, perhaps arrangements have to be made for that specific scenario, but not to the point of undue hardship. You know, I'm not telling your husband to go buy everybody a car.
Oh, if he is, we're all getting in line there.
Yeah, then I want to work there next.
I have a couple of questions that sprang up. One is when we're talking about the vaccine passport, it's not uncommon when you go into other countries, when we used to be able to travel freely, so to speak, to have that vaccine passport. And I mean, we all, those of us who have kids, remember when we used to take our kids to the health nurse and she would stamp our little card to show what our kids had. Is it unreasonable to think that that may actually be part of our identification process, like Alberta Healthcare or BC Healthcare or Ontario Healthcare sort of thing that says, you know, blood donor vaccinated? I'm not sure, I'm just spitballing, but is that an unreasonable assumption considering where we are right now?
I think the interesting thing about that question is, do I think we're going to start seeing kind of the comeback of some of those things, especially with travel? Absolutely. There's going to be countries that say there's no way you're coming into our country unless you can prove this. And, you know, people might challenge that, but at the end of the day, you know, each country has its own jurisdiction to make those decisions. So in terms of travel, absolutely, I think that's something that's going to come back, at the very least until kind of the worldwide hysteria around COVID-19 calms down. Not that I'm saying it's an inappropriate level of hysteria, but it is kind of the top of mind for everybody all the time. But when we take those passports and bring them into the employment environment and say, well, now you have to also provide those passports to your employer, well, I think that's when we start getting some kind of dicey things with respect to privacy. Because, you know, right now, can my employer ask me what my blood type is? You know, I think it would be a bit odd. And I think that I might be saying, well, hold up, you know, you can't ask about my marital status and you can't ask if I want to have babies, but you want to know what my blood type is. You know, you want to know if I've ever had, you know, my tonsils removed. You want to know if I had the flu shot for the last 2 years on top of the COVID-19 vaccination. You know, I think we start getting into some privacy concerns because not every employer is going to properly store or handle that information.
One question then that I have on that is, because most employers, myself included, would like to have a blanket policy that we put out that's going to protect us from all of the wolves out there looking to take us to the Supreme Court of Canada as the precedent setting company.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at your employment contracts and you're looking for that duty to accommodate, making sure that you've got occupational health and safety covered, is there an opportunity for those contracts to be revised and asked politely for employees to sign it on a voluntary basis, saying that they will disclose if or if not that they're going to be comfortable being vaccinated? And for new hires, can you make that mandatory because they're new to your company, so they're making that decision coming in whether they want to? Now, I know you can't give a definitive answer, but that is a query that is out there from the employer community.
Yeah, I think the problem that you would see if you say, okay, so new employees coming into my organization have to be vaccinated, and that's, you know, something they have to say yes to or prove in the interview process or in the initial contract, is that that's going to be an immediate Alberta human rights complaint, because they're essentially saying, well, this company is discriminating against me on the basis that I refuse to be vaccinated. And if that refusal to be vaccinated is also, say, paired with something, for example, like a religious purpose, then, you know, that's going to be a very valid human rights complaint. And when you just kind of blanket ask that, you know, to an employee or have them sign off on something to confirm, we don't really know the context of why they're refusing. You know, is it a religious purpose? Is it something to do, you know, with another aspect of their life? They're immunocompromised, something like that. So I think that blanket question to say, we're not hiring you unless you're vaccinated, is probably going to be challenged pretty quickly. And I think that you'll see that employers, those types of policies aren't standing in the courts, my opinion anyways. In terms of employees actually coming on, I don't think I would look at putting something like that in their actual contract. I think the contract should be, these are the terms of your employment, and these are the circumstances in which we can dismiss you, or the circumstances in which you get a raise, the circumstances of your holidays. But I think you can also incorporate policies as well. So you can look at building workplace policies employees are expected to sign off on. And in the contract itself, the employment contract, you can say that, breach of these policies that can lead to termination, essentially. So I think that the shaping of those kind of health and safety concerns should be looked at in the policy context of each workplace versus the actual employment contract. In my opinion.
We had a note in the chat bar with regards to the religious context. Yeah, and I've also seen, as you had said, the masks being queried in Ontario again because of creed. I don't feel we're any closer to a definitive answer, but at least we're starting the conversation in a positive note and understanding the context so we can share out that information.
Good morning, Melissa. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, nice to
Thank you. I know you're talking about employees, but what if the employer has a policy where everybody has to be vaccinated, and a self-employed, let's say an interpreter like me, we go to this company or a law firm that everybody has to be vaccinated, and I go and perform services. What happens then?
I think that's a really great question, because one thing we haven't addressed is contractors, which is a very different relationship with people than an employee. With a contractor, you kind of get to choose, right, to accept or not accept. That's the whole point of entering into the contract. But when you have, say, a relationship, for example, an interpreter with a law firm who has a relationship for a long time, and all of a sudden that law firm is making the vaccination mandatory, certainly I think that if that were to be the case, they said, yep, that's our policy, I think that they would probably exclude anybody from coming into that building who's doing some type of employment work, interpretation, or perhaps, anything else, from actually entering the building if they haven't been vaccinated. And again, I think that that's going to be a huge privacy challenge. And I think that any employer who does that as a blanket policy in an office workspace is going to face a lot of feedback from that. I mean, how do you get deliveries? Who are your clients that are coming into the office? I mean, what are the practicalities of saying all my employees have to be vaccinated, but we still have, people coming in on the day-to-day who could still spread this disease? I think that's a huge concern. But I think as a contractor, you're going to get to then choose and say, well, I'm no longer choosing to go to that firm because they do not have a vaccination policy, and I believe in vaccination. So that's the way I would kind of see it. But in terms of a right of refusal, something we didn't also touch on today is, what about small business? So if I own a restaurant, do I have the power to say to any patron that comes in, I need to see your vaccination passport, or I'm refusing you access to my restaurant or to my property? Right. So, and that's something where, outside of the employment context, am I having to carry my passport around because my local 7-Eleven won't let me in the door without it?
That'll put a new meaning to the big gulp.
Exactly. So, I mean, there's so many conversations to be had about this, because we kind of had this narrow chat about employers or contractors, and how that's going to affect that environment and what an employer can or can't do. I'll caveat it by saying, perhaps I'm completely wrong, and the Supreme Court of Canada says, yep, mandatory vaccinations are the way we're going. Safety is number one. But my suspicion is that's not going to be the case, because really there is such a giant concern with what information can your employer then demand from you in order for you to remain employed. But the business thing is a whole other conversation.
Absolutely. I think we're going to have this conversation again in early September. I think give people enough time to see how the vaccinations are going, where we are at that point in time. And I think we'll start to see a little bit more action or actionable items on direction that an employer can take. So if I can be so bold as to ask you to come back in September, and we can do this conversation again with a little bit more up-to-date information, I'd appreciate that.
That was spot on, Melissa. You nailed it. Really, really good. Thank you.
Yeah.
You've dug deep on this on all fronts. Certainly, I think the point you made about this isn't permanent, that eventually this thing will pass through the population. I think that's important for folks to keep in mind, that we work through this now, but eventually it'll go away.
Yeah, and some of those measures I think that employers are going to have to take are going to be temporary. And they may feel like, wow, I'm really having to bend over backwards to make this work. But
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to be on a permanent basis. So there's a lot of concern about what employers are going to have to do, but it's going to die down at some point, I think.
And as always, I thank everybody for coming out. I hope you found the information valuable. It's always good to know a lawyer. That's all I can say about that.